The blue luminescence of the monitor didn't just light the room, it bled into my retinas like a slow-acting poison, turning the air into a soup of static and ghosts. It was 3 in the morning, that hollow, necrotic hour where the world outside feels less like a place and more like a void waiting to be filled by something terrible. My apartment was a tomb of neglected ambitions, smelling of stale coffee and the ozone tang of an overheating motherboard. I sat there, hunched like a gargoyle over the keyboard, my eyes tracing the digital veins of the internet's darkest corners. I was hunting for something I couldn't name, a jagged piece of reality that didn't fit the puzzle of a normal life. That was when I found it. It appeared on a subforum dedicated to local disappearances, a digital scar that shouldn't have existed. The post was titled with a string of frantic, nonsensical characters that looked like someone had smashed their fist against the keys in a state of absolute terminal panic. I clicked it. The page loaded with a agonizing stutter, the browser struggling to render the heavy, unoptimized text. The user, a throwaway account with the handle Voidwalker77, had posted only 3 minutes prior. There were no images, only a block of text that vibrated with a visceral, jagged energy. "My friend is gone," it began, the lack of punctuation making the words feel like a breathless scream. "We went to Harwick. We weren't supposed to go. He's in the concrete. He's in the deep. They're changing him. If you see this, God help you, don't look for us." Below the frantic rambling were the coordinates: 41.8329 north, 72.7214 west. Harwick. The name hit me like a physical blow, cold and heavy. It was a name whispered in the local dive bars by old men whose eyes had gone milky with cataracts and secrets. An abandoned military bunker, a relic of a Cold War paranoia that had supposedly been gutted and sealed in the late 80s. It was a concrete monolith buried in the skin of the earth, a place where the government had allegedly played God with things that were never meant to breathe. I refreshed the page, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but the screen flickered. The post was gone. A 404 error stared back at me, a digital tombstone marking the spot where the truth had just been buried. But the coordinates were already etched into my mind, burning there like a brand. I felt a sudden, irrational spike of adrenaline, a chemical surge that tasted like copper and fear. The silence of my apartment suddenly felt predatory. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator, sounded like a footstep in a flooded basement. I looked at the dark window, seeing only my own reflection staring back, a pale, hollow-eyed ghost of a man consumed by the static. Why did I care? Why did I feel this gravitational pull toward a hole in the ground? It was the rot. The world felt thin, like wet paper, and I needed to see what was behind it. I reached for my jacket, the leather cold and cracked. My handgun, a heavy, reassuring weight of cold steel, sat in the drawer of my desk. I took it. I didn't know why, but the air in the room had turned freezing, a localized winter of the soul that told me I wasn't going to a place of peace. The coordinates led to a patch of forest so dense and forgotten that the maps themselves seemed to recoil from it. I wrote the numbers down on a scrap of paper, my handwriting jagged and unrecognizable. Harwick was calling, its voice a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my marrow. The blue light of the monitor finally flickered and died, plunging the room into a total, oppressive darkness. In that sudden void, I realized the murmuring hadn't come from the computer. It was coming from the air itself, a rhythmic, wet sound that mimicked the pulse of a dying heart. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just grabbed my keys and ran for the door, the coordinates a burning map in my pocket, leading me away from the safety of the light and toward the concrete throat of the bunker. The city outside was a skeletal ruin under the moonlight, the street lamps casting long, distorted shadows that looked like reaching limbs. Every alleyway felt like a mouth. I drove in a trance, the heater in my car blasting air that felt like it was pulled from a radiator in hell. I was a witness now. I was part of the story. The digital rod had found a host, and it was carrying me toward the Harwick military bunker, toward the place where the missing go to become something else. The road narrowed, the asphalt giving way to gravel and then to a dirt track choked by overhanging branches that clawed at the windshield like the fingers of a drowning man. The GPS on my phone flickered, the blue dot spinning aimlessly as if the earth itself had lost its orientation. I was close. I could feel the weight of the concrete pressing down on the forest, a subterranean pressure that made my ears pop. The air outside was thick with the smell of wet earth and something metallic, something like old blood and rusted iron. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, velvet cloak that smothered the sound of my own breathing. I looked at the scrap of paper. The coordinates were right here. Ahead, through the skeletal trees, the massive steel blast door of the bunker loomed like a gateway to a necrotic afterlife. It was partially open, a jagged black maw in the side of a hill, inviting me to come and see what the darkness had built. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the frost-covered needles, and felt the first true touch of the Harwick void. It wasn't just cold, it was a total absence of heat, a vacuum that sucked the life out of everything it touched. I gripped my flashlight, the beam cutting a weak, yellow path through the gloom, and began the long walk toward the entrance. The journey from the digital world to the physical one was complete. The cryptic lead had become a physical reality, a concrete throat waiting to swallow me whole. I thought of Voidwalker 77 and the friend who was in the concrete. I wondered if they were still screaming. I wondered if I would be the next one to post a message that no one would believe until it was too late. The bunker door groaned in a sudden gust of wind, a sound like a giant grinding its teeth. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The intrigue had curdled into a dark necessity. I stepped over the threshold, leaving the world of the living behind, and felt the heavy, freezing breath of the bunker wash over me. The stairs led down into a darkness that felt bottomless, a spiraling descent into the guts of a military nightmare. My flashlight beam hit the walls, revealing peeling paint and rusted pipes that looked like exposed veins. This was Harwick. This was the end of the line. I began to descend, each step echoing through the hollow levels like a heartbeat in an empty ribcage. The first sublevel was a graveyard of offices, desks overturned and papers scattered like autumn leaves in a cemetery. The second level was the barracks, rows of empty bunks that looked like open coffins. But it was the third level that held the secret, the restricted level, the place where the coordinates pointed. As I reached the bottom of the second flight of stairs, I stopped. My breath hitched in my throat, turning into a cloud of ice in the freezing air. There, in the thick, uniform dust of the corridor floor, was a single, fresh boot print. It was crisp, the edges sharp, as if someone had just stepped there seconds before. I wasn't alone. The realization sent a shiver down my spine that felt like a needle. I adjusted my grip on my gun, the cold metal biting into my palm. I followed the print, my flashlight beam scanning the floor. And then I saw it. The first smear of red. It wasn't a splash. It was a drag mark, thick and dark against the grey concrete. Something had been pulled down this hallway. Something heavy. Something that was still leaking. I followed the trail, the metallic smell of blood growing stronger, mixing with a new scent, a pungent, sweet aroma of decay and something chemical, like formaldehyde. The walls began to change. The smooth concrete was now marred by deep gouges, as if something with immense strength had clawed its way along the corridor. And then, I saw the handprint. It was high on the wall, nearly 7 feet up. It was massive, the fingers elongated and jointed in ways that defied human anatomy. It was pressed into the concrete in a thick, dark stain of drying gore. It wasn't human. Nothing that lived in the sun could have made that mark. I felt the urge to turn back, to run until my lungs burned, but the bunker held me in its grip. I was a moth to a necrotic flame. I pushed deeper into the junction room, the space opening up into a cavernous vault of shadows and machinery. My flashlight beam swept the ceiling, and that's when I saw him. A man, dressed in tattered civilian clothes, was suspended 5 feet off the ground. He wasn't hanging by a rope. He was encased in a thick, pulsating mass of red, biological webbing. It looked like a network of exposed nerves, glistening and wet, anchoring him to the ceiling and the walls. His body was convulsing in slow, rhythmic spasms, his head lolling back to reveal eyes that had been glazed over with a milky film. He tried to speak, but the only sound that escaped his throat was a wet, involuntary groan, a sound of absolute, soul-crushing agony. I took a step back, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. The webbing was alive. I could see it twitching, drawing something out of him, or perhaps pumping something in. And then, the sound changed. A sharp, skittering noise erupted from the darkness above. I swung my flashlight up, and the beam caught it. The creature dropped from the ceiling with a sickening thud, landing directly onto the web. It was a nightmare of geometry and biology. It had the body of a massive, asymmetrical insect, its limbs jointed and covered in a fine, black down that seemed to absorb the light. But it was the abdomen that made my stomach turn. Stretched tightly across the bulbous, pulsating sac of its lower body was a human face. It wasn't a mask. It was skin, living and breathing, the features distorted but unmistakably human. And it was murmuring. A continuous, low-frequency drone of words, a litany of names and coordinates, the voice sounding like 1,000 people speaking at once in a drowned whisper. It turned its multifaceted eyes toward me, the human face on its belly contorting into a silent scream. I didn't think. I just raised my gun and fired. The blue light of the monitor was a scalpel, peeling back my eyelids in the dead hours of 3 a.m. I shouldn't have been on those subreddits, the digital gutters where the desperate and the deluded go to bleed their stories into the void. But then I saw it. A frantic, glitching transmission posted by a user named FoundNothing88. It wasn't a story. It was a suicide note written in coordinates and terror. He claimed his brother had vanished while exploring the Harwick military bunker, a relic of a Cold War that had never quite ended in the minds of the locals. As I watched, the page refreshed. Deleted. Scoured from the server by a moderator or perhaps something faster. But the numbers were burned into my retinas, a litany of degrees and minutes that pointed toward a patch of forest where the map simply gave up. I didn't think about the risk. I only thought about the silence that follows a disappearance, a heavy, static-filled quiet that demands to be broken. I grabbed my grandfather's old .45, the cold steel a heavy comfort against my hip, and a tactical flashlight that promised to cut through the dark. I drove for 3 hours, the world outside my windshield dissolving into a blur of skeletal pines and jagged shadows. Harwick wasn't just a bunker, it was a bruise on the landscape, a concrete monolith buried under a mountain of shale and dead needles. The air here felt processed, recycled through the lungs of a giant that had stopped breathing decades ago. The blast door was a jaw left slightly agape, a rusted invitation into the throat of the earth. I squeezed through, the metal groaning a warning that I ignored. Inside, the darkness was absolute. It was a physical weight, a suffocating velvet that pressed against my skin. My flashlight beam was a pathetic needle, stitching together fragments of a rotting reality. Pipes hummed with a phantom current, and the smell of ozone and wet limestone filled my nose. This was the cold dark, a place where time didn't pass so much as it congealed. I descended. Sublevel 1 was a purgatory of abandoned bureaucracy, desks like tombstones, filing cabinets overflowing with papers that had turned to grey mulch. Sublevel 2 was the barracks, where the smell of stale wool and ancient sweat still lived in the peeling lead paint. But it was the transition to Sublevel 3 where the dread truly took root. This was the restricted zone, a place meant for secrets too heavy for the surface. The dust here was a uniform blanket, an undisturbed shroud 50 years in the making. Then, my light hit the floor near the stairwell. A single boot print. The edges were sharp, the rubber tread distinct. It was fresh. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't alone in this tomb. The trail didn't end with a footprint. As I moved deeper into the subterranean maze, the walls began to tell a story I didn't want to read. A furrow had been carved into the dust, a drag mark as if something heavy and meat-dense had been hauled toward the dark heart of the facility. Smears of red, too bright, too oxygenated to be old, painted the concrete in jagged, frantic strokes. And then I saw it, high up near the rusted ventilation grate. A handprint. But it was a mockery of human anatomy. It was a sprawling, 5-fingered splay of obsidian black residue, the palm as wide as a dinner plate, the fingers ending in needle-thin points that had punctured the concrete itself. It looked like a shadow that had been burned into the wall. The corridor opened into a massive junction room, and my flashlight beam died in the vastness of the space. I clicked it off and on, my heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. When the light returned, it revealed a transformation. The walls were no longer concrete. They were veiled in thick, translucent red membrane. It looked like biological lace, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heat that made the air shimmer. In the center of the room, suspended in a web of this weeping, organic silk, was a man. His eyes were wide, glazed with a milky film of shock. He was convulsing in slow, agonizing waves, his body a prisoner to the webbing. I moved closer, my boots sticking to the floor. I tried to speak, to offer some fragment of hope, but he only opened his mouth to emit a wet, involuntary groan. It was the sound of a man who had been hollowed out while still conscious, a vessel for a pain that had no name. That was when the ceiling screamed. A shadow detached itself from the overhead pipes, dropping with a sickening, wet thud onto the red web. It didn't land like an animal. It landed like a nightmare made manifest. It was a horrifying architecture of chitin and flesh, an asymmetrical, insectile body supported by multiple jointed limbs that moved with the precision of a clockwork killer. But the horror, the true, soul-searing rot of the thing, was its abdomen. Stretched tightly across the underside was a human face, distorted, translucent, yet undeniably recognizable. Its mouth moved in a low-frequency drone of words, a litany of names and coordinates, the voice sounding like 1,000 people speaking at once in a drowned whisper. It turned its multifaceted eyes toward me, the human face on its belly contorting into a silent scream. I didn't think. I just raised my gun and fired. The muzzle flash was a momentary sun, searing the image of the creature into my brain. The beast shrieked, a sound of metal shearing metal, and I didn't stay to see if the lead had found a home. I turned and ran. I ran with a desperation that bypassed thought, my boots hammering against the concrete, my breath coming in jagged, burning gasps. The maze of Sublevel 3 became a kaleidoscopic blur of grey and red. Behind me, the sound of the pursuit was a rhythmic terror, the rapid-fire skittering of jointed limbs, the scraping of bone claws against the walls. It was gaining. The air in the corridors turned thick, smelling of rotting meat and ozone, as if the creature was carrying the atmosphere of the bunker's heart with it. I felt the heat of its breath, a static-charged presence that made the hair on my arm stand up. I burst through the blast door, the freezing night air hitting my lungs like a physical blow. I didn't look back. I threw myself into my car, the engine screaming as I tore away from the Harwick facility. I drove until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, until the bunker was nothing more than a bad memory buried in the shale. I didn't feel safe until I was back in my apartment, the door triple locked, the lights blazing in every room to banish the void. I stripped off my jacket, my hand shaking so hard I could barely work the zipper. That's when I saw it. Stuck to the heavy canvas of my sleeve was a single, highly elastic strand of that red webbing. It was tacky, vibrating with a rhythmic, parasitic life of its own. I tried to pull it off, but it clung to the fabric, a crimson tether connecting me to the thing in the dark. A hitchhiker. I fell into a fitful sleep on the sofa, the gun still clutched in my hand. But the silence of the apartment didn't last. I jolted awake in the dead of the night, the darkness of my living room feeling suddenly heavy, processed, and recycled. From the corner of the room, near the open closet, came a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was a wet, involuntary groan. And then, the rhythmic murmuring started. 1,000 voices, whispering my name, my coordinates, my secrets. The shadow in the corner shifted, a jointed limb scraping against the hardwood floor. I raised the .45, my eyes straining against the dark, realizing too late that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The face on the abdomen was waiting for me. The steel door behind me didn't just close. It groaned with the weight of decades, a rusted, monolithic shriek that echoed through the hollow ribcage of the Harwick bunker until it was swallowed by the dark. I stood there, the Glock heavy in my palm, my knuckles white against the grip. The air was a different kind of cold down here. It wasn't the crisp, biting winter of the surface. It was a stagnant, tomb-like chill that felt like wet wool against the skin, smelling of ionized salt and the slow, rhythmic rot of abandoned things. My flashlight cut a jagged hole in the gloom, a trembling circle of white light that revealed the skeletal remains of Level 2, empty desks, chairs overturned like broken limbs, and filing cabinets that looked like rows of silent, metal teeth. I didn't stop there. The coordinates from the Reddit post didn't point to the offices. They pointed deeper. They pointed to the marrow. I found the stairwell to Sublevel 3. The door was a heavy slab of reinforced titanium, half off its hinges, leaning at an impossible angle as if something had tried to squeeze through and found the gap too narrow. I squeezed through instead, the metal scraping against my jacket with a sound like a blade on bone. As I stepped onto the concrete of the restricted level, the atmosphere shifted. The silence was no longer empty. It was pressurized, a heavy, static hum that vibrated in my inner ear, making my vision blur at the edges. The emergency lighting was still functional here, though only barely. Every few seconds, an overhead bulb would flicker with a sickly, orange pulse, casting long, strobing shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the walls and dance in the periphery of my vision. I swept the floor with my light. The dust here was uniform, a thick, grey velvet that hadn't been disturbed since the Cold War. Or so I thought. Then, the beam caught it. A single, distinct indentation. A boot print. It was fresh, the edges of the tread sharp and clear in the silt, pointing toward the heavy-duty maintenance corridor. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Someone was here, or someone had been here very recently. I followed it, my breath hitching in my throat, each step I took feeling like a plunge into a freezing void. The boot prints were joined by others, scuffs, frantic slides, the chaotic trail of someone running, someone desperate. Then the dust ended, and the wetness began. At first, I thought it was hydraulic fluid leaking from the rusted pipes overhead. It was dark, almost black under the flickering orange strobe of the lights. But as I leaned closer, the coppery tang hit me, thick and cloying, filling my nostrils with the iron scent of a slaughterhouse. It wasn't oil. It was blood. It started as a few spatters, like dark rain on the concrete, but as I moved deeper into the corridor, it transformed into a continuous, wide drag mark. Something heavy had been hauled across the floor. The trail was messy, erratic, accompanied by smears along the baseboards where fingers had frantically clawed for purchase against the cold stone. I followed the trail past a row of reinforced holding cells, my light flickering in rhythm with the overhead bulbs. The static in my ears was getting louder now, a wet, rhythmic pulsing that sounded like a heart beating inside a bucket of water. I turned a corner, my gun raised, my finger trembling on the trigger, and that's when I saw it. The blood wasn't just on the floor anymore. It was on the walls. A massive, sweeping arc of gore painted the concrete, and in the center of that red ruin was the mark. It wasn't a human handprint. It was too large, the size of a man's entire torso, pressed into the wet crimson with a violent, crushing force. I moved the flashlight beam over it, my hand shaking so violently the light danced like a dying star. There were too many joints. Each finger, if you could call them that, was a series of elongated, multi-segmented limbs that ended in hooked, chitinous points. The palm was a deep, recessed pit of broken skin and strange, radial textures, as if the thing that made it possessed a grip that could liquefy bone. The sight of it sent a jolt of pure, electric terror through my nervous system. This wasn't a man. Whatever had taken the poster's friend, whatever had dragged him through these corridors, was something that didn't belong to the world of light. I looked at the handprint and saw the geometry of something ancient and hungry. The edges of the print were beginning to crust, turning a dark, bruised purple, but the center was still glistening, still fresh. The flickering light above me hummed louder, a high-pitched whine that threatened to shatter my teeth. In the brief pulses of orange, I could see the trail continuing, leading toward the central junction room where the air was thickest with that rotten ozone stench. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to turn and run, to sprint back up those stairs and never look back, to pretend I never saw the Reddit post, never saw the coordinates, never saw the blood. But the silence of the bunker was broken then. From the darkness ahead, through the heavy, stagnant air of the corridor, came a sound that froze the marrow in my bones. It was a groan, low, wet, and involuntary. It wasn't the sound of a predator. It was the sound of a man who was being unmade. I forced my feet to move, the Glock a useless weight in my hand against whatever had left that monstrous sigil on the wall. The hallway opened up into the junction room, a cavernous space filled with humming machinery and rusted tanks. My flashlight beam hit the center of the room and died for a second, the batteries failing under the crushing weight of the electromagnetic interference. I slapped the side of the light, the beam sputtering back to life just in time to see the webbing. It wasn't spider silk. It was a thick, translucent red biological lace, pulsing with a faint, internal light. It coated the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, looking like a network of exposed veins. And there, suspended in the center of the mass like a fly in amber, was a man. He was stripped to the waist, his skin a pale, sickly grey, held aloft by the thick cords of red webbing that seemed to be growing into his very flesh. His chest was heaving in shallow, jagged gasps, but he couldn't speak. His jaw was locked, his eyes rolled back into his head, showing only the whites. I stepped forward, a sob catching in my throat, but the static in the room suddenly reached a deafening crescendo. The overhead emergency light gave one final, violent flash before shattering, plunging the room into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. In that final microsecond of light, I looked up. Something was clinging to the ceiling directly above the web. It was a nightmare of asymmetrical geometry, a mass of jointed, insect-like limbs that seemed to fold and unfold in ways that defied the human eye. Its body was a bloated, chitinous thorax, but as it began to drop, the flashlight beam caught its underside. Stretched tight across the creature's abdomen, woven into its very hide, was a human face. Not a mask, but a living, breathing face, its features distorted and elongated by the stretch of the monster's growth. The eyes on the abdomen were wide and lidless, and the mouth was moving. It wasn't screaming. It was murmuring. A continuous, low-frequency stream of words. My name, the coordinates, the secrets I thought I'd buried. The creature hit the webbing with a wet thud that vibrated through the floorboards and into my boots. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just began to fire. The muzzle flashes of the .45 were the only light left in the world, brief, strobe-like glimpses of the monstrosity as it skidded across the red webbing toward me, its many limbs scraping against the concrete with the sound of 1,000 knives. I turned and ran. I ran into the blind, suffocating dark of the maze, the sound of the creature's murmuring belly echoing off the walls behind me. I could hear it, the rapid-fire clicking of its legs, the wet slap of its body against the floor, the rhythmic, high-pitched scratching of its claws as it rounded the corners I had just passed. I didn't find the stairs. I found a service ladder, a vertical shaft of rusted iron that I climbed with a strength born of pure, primal hysteria. I don't remember getting to the car. I don't remember the drive. I only remember the silence of my apartment 2 hours later, the way the streetlights outside cast long, familiar shadows across my living room floor. I sat on the edge of my bed, my breath finally slowing, the Glock resting on the nightstand. I thought I was safe. I thought the bunker was behind me. Then I looked down at my sleeve. Stuck to the heavy fabric of my jacket was a single, 3-inch strand of the red webbing. It was tacky to the touch, vibrating with a faint, rhythmic pulse that matched my own heartbeat. I reached out to pull it off, but it didn't budge. It was elastic, stretching like a piece of raw sinew, anchored deep into the fibers of the coat. I sat there in the dark, staring at it, until the exhaustion finally pulled me under. But sleep brought no peace. I woke up hours later, the room bathed in the pre-dawn grey. The silence of the apartment was gone. From the corner of the room, near the closet door, came a sound. A low, wet groan. And then, the murmuring started. It was the same rhythmic, nonsensical stream of words from the bunker, spoken in a voice that sounded like wet leather being torn. I reached for the gun, my fingers trembling, my eyes straining against the shadows. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the floorboards, from the walls, from the very air I was breathing. The face on the abdomen was waiting for me. And as I raised the weapon, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. Some doors, once you open them, become part of you. The Harwick bunker wasn't just a place. It was a contagion. And I had brought the marrow home. The blue light of the monitor was a cold, digital hum against the blackness of my apartment. It was 3:14 a.m. when the post appeared on the local mysteries subreddit. It was a jagged burst of text, frantic and unedited, typed by someone whose fingers must have been shaking. Coordinates, a name, Harwick, and a plea for anyone to find a man named Elias who had gone into the earth and never come back. I refreshed the page, but the post was gone, scrubbed by a moderator or deleted by a ghost. I didn't care. The coordinates were already burned into my retinas, a map to a place the government had tried to forget 40 years ago. I reached for my jacket, the weight of the Glock 17 in my waistband a heavy, reassuring anchor against the rising tide of my own curiosity. The drive was a descent into a skeletal landscape. The road to Harwick was more gravel and weed than asphalt, winding through trees that looked like reaching, necrotic fingers clawing at the moonless sky. When the bunker finally appeared, it wasn't a building so much as a scar on the hillside. A massive, rusted steel blast door stood partially agape, a tongue of darkness licking out from the concrete throat of the facility. The air coming from within was unnaturally cold, carrying the scent of ozone, wet copper, and something that smelled like very old, very deep rot. I clicked my flashlight into life. The beam was a pathetic needle of light against the obsidian moor. I stepped inside, the heavy groan of the door behind me sounding like the closing of a coffin lid. The first 2 levels were a graveyard of bureaucracy. Sublevel 1 was a labyrinth of empty offices, desks overturned like sun-bleached ribcage, paper trails leading to dead ends. Sublevel 2 was the barracks, row after row of rusted iron cots that looked like instruments of torture in the dancing shadows of my light. The dust here was uniform, a thick, grey velvet that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Or so I thought. I reached the stairwell leading to the restricted 3rd sublevel, and the beam of my light caught a disruption in the grey. A single, fresh boot print. The edges were sharp. The tread was modern. Someone had been here hours, maybe minutes, ago. My heart began a staccato rhythm against my ribs, a frantic drum in the silence of the void. I descended. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the oxygen was being replaced by something more viscous. On the walls of the third sublevel corridor, the peeling paint gave way to something else. Drag marks. They started as thin, desperate scrapes and evolved into wide, wet smears of fresh blood. It wasn't just on the floor, it was on the walls, reaching high toward the ceiling. Then I saw it. Amidst the chaos of the blood, there was a print. It wasn't a boot. It wasn't a hand. It was a massive, splayed impression of 5 elongated, jointed digits, tipped with depressions that suggested hooked talons. It was larger than my head, and it wasn't human. It was a tectonic shift in my understanding of the world, a realization that the food chain had just grown a new, terrifying peak. I rounded a corner and the darkness changed. The white beam of my flashlight was swallowed by a pulsing, biological red glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I stepped into a massive junction room, and my breath hitched in my throat. The room was choked with it, thick, translucent strands of red webbing that looked like spun muscle and clotted veins. It hung from a ceiling in heavy, weeping curtains, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that I felt in my teeth. In the center of the web, suspended 6 feet off the ground, was a man. Elias. He was wrapped in a cocoon of the red sinew, his limbs twisted at impossible angles. He wasn't dead. His chest was heaving in shallow, liquid gasps, and his eyes were wide, rolled back into his head. He was convulsing, a rhythmic, involuntary twitching that sent ripples through the entire web. He tried to speak, but all that came out were wet, guttural groans, the sound of a man drowning in his own throat. Then the ceiling moved. It didn't just drop, it unfolded. A nightmare made of chitin and wet meat plummeted from the darkness above, landing silently on the web. It was massive, an asymmetrical horror of multiple jointed limbs that moved with a sickening, liquid grace. Its body was a chaotic mess of insectoid plates and pulsing sacs of red fluid. But it was the abdomen that shattered my mind. Stretched tightly across the bulbous, twitching rear of the creature was a human face. Not a mask, but a living, breathing face, its skin pulled so thin it was translucent. The eyes were milk-white and roving, and the mouth was moving. It was murmuring, a continuous, low-volume stream of words, a litany of names and prayers in a voice that sounded like static over a dead radio. The Weaver turned toward me. The murmuring stopped. I didn't think. I pulled the Glock and squeezed the trigger. The thunder of the shots was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flashes illuminating the creature's glistening, oily hide. It shrieked, a sound that wasn't a scream but a high-pitched grinding of metal on bone. I didn't wait to see if the bullets found their mark. I turned and ran. I ran with a desperation I didn't know I possessed, my boots hammering against the concrete as I fled the red glow. Behind me, I heard it, the rapid, staccato scraping of many limbs against the floor and walls. It was fast. It was heavy. It was coming for the marrow. I dived through corridors, my flashlight beam swinging wildly, illuminating flickers of the creature's shadow as it bypassed the turns by scurrying across the ceiling. I reached the blast door, squeezed through the gap, and didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine screaming as I tore away from the Harwick facility. I made it back to my apartment. I locked every door, pushed my dresser in front of the entrance, and sat on my bed, clutching my gun until my knuckles were white. I tried to breathe, tried to tell myself it was over. Then I saw it. On the sleeve of my jacket, near the cuff, was a single strand of the red webbing. It was highly elastic, tacky to the touch, and it glowed with a faint, dying ember of that subterranean light. I tried to pull it off, but it was stuck, bonded to the fabric like a parasitic vine. It felt hot against my skin, a searing, necrotic heat that seemed to seep through the cloth and into my very blood. The silence of my apartment began to fray. I sat there in the dark, the adrenaline fading into a cold, hollow dread. And then, the sound started. It was faint at first, coming from the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. A wet, involuntary groan. A rhythmic, liquid struggle for breath. And then, the murmuring began, the exact same static-choked litany I had heard in the depths of the bunker. It wasn't just a memory. The sound was inside the room. It was coming from the darkness near my ceiling, a scraping sound of jointed limbs against the drywall, a homecoming of the Weaver. I raised the weapon, my hand shaking as the red glow began to pulse from the corner of my eye. I realized then that I hadn't escaped Harwick. I had invited it in. The face on the abdomen was waiting for me, and as I leveled the barrel into the void, I knew that some doors, once you open them, become part of you. The Harwick bunker wasn't just a place. It was a contagion. And I had brought the marrow home. The murmuring grew louder, a chorus of 1,000 stolen voices, and as the first red strand touched my shoulder, I knew the final standoff had begun. The cold didn't stay at Harwick. It followed me like a stray dog, nipping at my heels, burrowing into the marrow of my bones until my very blood felt like slush. I remember the drive back, though remember is too solid a word for that blur of static and adrenaline. The road was a black vein through a dead landscape, and every tree that flickered through my headlights looked like a limb, every shadow a reaching, multi-jointed appendage. My hands were fused to the steering wheel, my knuckles white and calcified, shaking with a rhythmic violence that threatened to rattle the car apart. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see that asymmetrical silhouette looming in the backseat, its stolen human face pressed against the glass, murmuring secrets into the upholstery. But there was only the void of the highway, an obsidian mouth swallowing the miles. When I finally reached my apartment, the silence was a physical weight. It was a pressurized vacuum that made my ears pop. I didn't turn on the lights. I couldn't. Light felt like an invitation, a flare sent up to signal my position to whatever was hunting the night. I leaned against the heavy oak of my front door, the deadbolt clicking home with a finality that felt like a coffin lid being hammered shut. I was safe. I told myself that until the words lost meaning and became a jagged, repetitive mantra. I was in my sanctuary, surrounded by the mundane debris of a normal life, the smell of stale coffee, the stack of unread mail on the counter, the hum of the refrigerator. But the bunker had changed the geography of my mind. The walls felt thinner, the corners deeper, as if the rot of Harwick had infected the very architecture of my reality. I peeled off my jacket, my fingers fumbling with the zipper. The fabric felt heavy, sodden with the freezing dampness of the subterranean levels. And then I saw it. In the pale, sickly natural moonlight filtering through the blinds, a sliver of color caught my eye. It was a strand of red. At first, I thought it was a loose thread, a stray bit of polyester from the lining. But when I reached out to brush it away, it didn't fall. It stretched. It was a highly elastic, tacky filament of biological webbing, the color of a fresh bruise. It was rooted into the sleeve of my jacket, a jagged umbilical cord of red ichor that seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. I pulled at it, and the resistance was sickeningly organic. It didn't snap, it elongated, thinning out into a translucent gossamer that vibrated under my touch. It felt hot, feverish, against my cold skin. It wasn't just stuck to the fabric, it had fused with it, weaving itself into the weave of the coat, a piece of the nightmare that had hitched a ride out of the dark. I dropped the jacket as if it were a burning coal. It hit the floor with a wet, heavy thud that sounded far too much like a heartbeat. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps that tasted of copper and ozone. The paranoia was no longer a shadow. It was a physical presence, a staticum in the back of my skull. I moved toward my bedroom, my eyes darting toward every dark doorway. The moonlight was a pale, cataract white, casting long, distorted shadows across the floorboards. The shadows seemed to be twitching, detaching themselves from the furniture, crawling along the baseboards with a slow, deliberate malice. I reached for my handgun, the cold steel of the grip the only thing that felt real in a world that was rapidly liquefying into a gothic horror. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, the gun resting on my knees, watching the door. The apartment was a tomb of silence, until it wasn't. It started as a vibration, a low-frequency thrum that I felt in my teeth before I heard it with my ears. It was the sound of something wet being dragged across the ceiling of the living room. Schlick, schlick, schlick. The sound of a heavy, chitinous weight shifting against the plaster. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone. Then came the murmuring. It wasn't a single voice. It was a chorus, a distorted, overlapping cacophagus of 1,000 stolen whispers. It was the sound of the missing, the echoes of the men and women who had vanished into the Harwick coordinates, their vocal cords stretched and repurposed by a thing that didn't understand human speech, only the shape of it. The voices were wet, bubbling through a throat filled with fluid, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my brain. Help me, please. It's so cold. Stay with us. Alex. My name. It said my name. The murmuring wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was echoing from the living room, growing louder, more insistent, accompanied by the sound of something many-limbed and heavy dropping from the ceiling onto the hardwood. I heard the unmistakable sound of the red webbing being spun, a frantic, sticky weaving noise that filled the air with the smell of rotting meat and old blood. The wet groaning followed, the sound of the man I had seen in the bunker, the one suspended in the red web, his lungs laboring against the encroaching biological silk. It was a sound of absolute, unmitigated agony, a sound that stripped away the last of my sanity. It was rhythmic. It was close. I stood up, my legs feeling like water. I raised the handgun, my sight trembling in the dim moonlight. I moved toward the bedroom door, every step a descent back into the bunker. The air in the hallway was thick now, humid and foul, the pale light revealing long, glistening strands of red webbing draped across the walls like tattered funeral shrouds. The apartment was being colonized. The Harwick bunker wasn't just a place, it was a contagion, and I was the carrier. I had brought the marrow home, and now the entity was building its hive in the center of my life. I reached the doorway to the living room and stopped. The moonlight hit the center of the floor, illuminating a mass of twitching, asymmetrical limbs. It was the creature. It was hunched over my discarded jacket, its multiple jointed legs clicking against the floor like knitting needles made of bone. It was larger than it had been in the bunker, its body bloated and pulsing with a sickly, internal radiance. And the human face stretched tightly across its abdomen, was staring directly at me. Its eyes were wide, milky voids, and its mouth was moving in perfect synchronization with the murmurs that filled the room. The creature didn't roar. It didn't hiss. It simply began to unfurl, its limbs extending with a series of wet, snapping sounds. It began to crawl up the wall, its movements jagged and impossible, its weight causing the drywall to crack and crumble. The red strands followed it, erupting from its segmented body, reaching out for me like questing fingers. I realized then that the standoff wouldn't end in the hallway. It wouldn't end with a gunshot. The creature wasn't just in my apartment, it was becoming my apartment. The walls were pulsing. The floor was softening into a bed of red silk. The murmuring grew into a roar, a tidal wave of stolen voices that drowned out my own scream. As the first red strand touched my shoulder, hot and tacky and hungry, I leveled the gun at the center of that stolen face. The moonlight caught the brass of the casing as I squeezed the trigger, a final, futile spark of defiance in a room that was no longer mine, in a world that was being consumed by the rot of the Harwick void. The silence was gone forever. There was only the murmur, the groan, and the rhythmic, wet heartbeat of the nightmare I had invited in. The engine of my car was a dying animal, coughing and wheezing as I tore away from the Harwick military installation. The heater was blasted to its maximum setting, but the air blowing through the vents felt like the breath of a corpse, recycled, stale, and unnaturally cold. My hands were locked onto the steering wheel, my knuckles white and trembling, the skin there stained with the black grease of the bunker's blast doors and the copper tang of my own frantic sweat. Every few seconds, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror, expecting to see those asymmetrical, jointed limbs unfolding from the shadows of the backseat, or the pale, stretched face of a lost soul pressed against the rear glass. But there was only the road. A ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the skeletal trees, swallowed by a mist that looked like grey static. I was back in the world of the living, or so I desperately tried to convince the panicked animal screaming inside my skull. The city lights eventually began to bleed through the gloom, orange and sickly, casting long, jagged shadows across the dashboard. I drove like a ghost, oblivious to traffic laws, my mind a fractured loop of that third sublevel, the smell of wet copper, the rhythmic thud of something heavy dropping onto the webbing, and those eyes. God, those eyes. They weren't the eyes of a predator. They were the eyes of a collection. When I finally reached my apartment complex, a brutalist concrete slab that felt more like a tomb than a home, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted from the car, my handgun heavy and cold against my hip, its presence a small, metallic comfort that felt increasingly useless against the vast, rotting void I had witnessed. Inside, the lobby was silent. The fluorescent lights flickered with a high-pitched hum that set my teeth on edge, sounding too much like the chittering of the thing in the dark. I bypassed the elevator. The thought of being trapped in a metal box was unbearable, and took the stairs two at a time, my boots echoing like gunshots in the stairwell. By the time I reached my door, my lungs were burning, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps that tasted of iron and ozone. I fumbled with the keys, the metal scraping against the lock with a sound like a blade on bone. I slammed the door behind me, engaging every bolt, every chain, leaning my back against the wood until I slid down to the floor. I was safe. The bunker was miles away, buried under layers of earth and forgotten history. I was in my sanctuary, but as I sat there in the dim glow of the hallway light, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating dread. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking so violently I could barely keep them flat on my knees. And then I saw it. On the sleeve of my heavy tactical jacket, caught near the cuff, was a strand. It wasn't lint. It wasn't a loose thread. It was a thick, elastic cord of deep, visceral red. It looked like a vein pulled from a living body, still slick with a translucent, tacky film. My heart stopped. I reached out a trembling finger to touch it, and the moment my skin made contact, I felt a faint, rhythmic pulse. It wasn't my own pulse. It was slow, wet, and heavy, vibrating through the fabric and into my marrow. The webbing didn't just sit there. It seemed to be anchored, its microscopic hooks buried deep into the weave of the nylon. I tried to flick it off, but it stretched, thinning out into a gossamer fine line of gore before snapping back against the sleeve with a wet, fleshy pop. It was a tether, a biological GPS, a piece of the Harwick void that I had carried home like a parasite. I stripped the jacket off with a frantic, revulsion-filled cry, flinging it into the far corner of the living room. I stumbled into the bathroom, splashing freezing water onto my face, trying to scrub the sensation of that pulse from my fingertips. I looked into the mirror, and for a second, the reflection didn't look like me. The shadows under my eyes were too deep, like bruised craters, and the skin of my throat seemed to ripple as if something were crawling just beneath the surface. I looked away, leaning over the sink, my eyes blurring with tears of pure, unadulterated panic. That's when the light died. It wasn't a bulb burnout. It was an extraction. The light didn't flicker. It was simply sucked out of the room, as if the darkness had suddenly gained mass and swallowed the glow of the vanity. I froze. The silence of the apartment was absolute, a heavy, obsidian weight that pressed against my eardrums. And then, through the silence, came the sound. It started as a low vibration in the floorboards, a rhythmic, wet heartbeat that matched the pulse of the red strand on my jacket. Thump squish. Thump squish. It was coming from the living room. My breath hitched in my throat, a jagged shard of air that refused to move. Then came the murmur. It wasn't a single voice. It was a chorus of hushed, overlapping whispers, a cacophony of names and prayers and nonsensical strings of numbers, all delivered in a flat, monotone drone. It was the sound of the faces on the creature's abdomen. They were here. I reached for the handgun on the counter, my fingers closing around the grip with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity. I stepped out of the bathroom, my back against the wall, moving toward the living room where the shadows were thickest. The air in the apartment had changed. It no longer smelled of my coffee or the faint scent of old books. It smelled of wet earth, fermented rot, and the sharp, acidic tang of something ancient and hungry. A wet groan echoed from the ceiling. It was a sound of immense physical effort, the sound of bones shifting against cartilage, accompanied by a series of rapid, metallic scrapes. Screetich. Screetich. Something was moving above me, navigating the crown molding with a terrifying, multi-limbed grace. I raised the gun, the barrel shaking in the pitch darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the temperature dropping, the heat being drained from the room as if a gateway to the Harwick bunker had opened in my very ceiling. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice breaking. The question was a joke, a pathetic plea for a reality that no longer existed. The murmuring stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, a predatory stillness that felt like a coiled spring. Then, a voice emerged from the dark. It wasn't the creature's voice, but the voice of the man I had seen in the webbing, the one whose eyes had pleaded for an end that wouldn't come. "Alex," the voice murmured. It didn't come from a throat. It sounded like it was being squeezed out of a wet sponge. "Alex, it's so cold. The web. It's so warm inside the web. Join the census. Join the records. We are all documented now." I fired. The muzzle flash was a blinding, momentary star in the void, illuminating the room for a fraction of a second. In that strobe light instant, I saw it. It was crouched in the corner where the ceiling met the wall, its massive, asymmetrical body blotting out the corner of the room. Its limbs were hooked into the plaster, causing long, jagged cracks to spider web across the paint. And the face, the human face stretched across its pulsating, insectoid abdomen, was looking directly at me, its lips moving in a frantic, silent prayer. The bullet hit the ceiling, a shower of plaster raining down, but the creature didn't flinch. It dropped. It didn't fall. It descended on a thick, red cord of that biological webbing, its multiple legs unfolding like a cluster of rusted knives. I fired again, and again, the flashes revealing the monstrosity as it swung toward me. I saw the wet, glistening sheen of its carapace, the way the human skin of its underbelly was stitched to the chitin with thick, black thread. I saw the mouth, not the human mouth, but the creature's true mouth, a vertical slit of needle teeth that vibrated with a low, subharmonic growl. I backed away, tripping over the coffee table, falling hard onto the carpet. The gun flew from my hand, sliding into the darkness under the sofa. I scrambled backward on my elbows, my heels digging into the floor, as the rhythmic, wet heartbeat grew louder, filling the room, filling my head. The murmuring was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, 1,000 voices screaming their own names into the void of my apartment. I felt something sticky brush against my ankle. I looked down, and even in the total darkness, I could see the faint, bioluminescent glow of the red webbing. It was spreading across the floor like a fungal infection, a web of veins that were pulsing in time with the creature's heart. It was anchoring me. It was claiming the room, turning my home into another sublevel of the Harwick bunker. The creature was inches away now. I could feel the heat radiating from its massive, distorted body, a sickening, feverish warmth that smelled of decay. I could hear the wet clicking of its joints as it repositioned itself over me, its shadow a solid weight that pressed the air from my lungs. A long, multi-jointed limb, tipped with a hook like a meat cleaver, slowly lowered from the darkness, grazing my cheek. The skin it touched felt instantly numb, as if the creature were injecting a paralytic directly into my pores. I reached out, my hands searching the floor in a blind, frantic panic, until my fingers brushed the cold steel of the handgun. I gripped it, my thumb fumbling for the safety, my breath coming in a final, sobbing gasp. I didn't aim. There was no point in aiming in a world of total pitch. I simply pointed the barrel upward, toward the center of the rhythmic, wet heartbeat, toward the center of the murmur that was now a scream. Everything was rotting. The walls, the air, my own memories. It was all being consumed by the static of the Harwick void. The silence was gone forever. There was only the murmur, the groan, and the rhythmic, wet heartbeat of the nightmare I had invited in. As I squeezed the trigger, a final, futile spark of defiance in a room that was no longer mine, I realized the truth. The bunker wasn't a place you visited. It was a condition. And I was finally being processed.